Hello, this is David from DN Cognitive Counseling. Tonight, I'm going to be handling and tackling the introduction to white fragility. That's right, we got past the author's notes and now finally into the introduction. The introduction is titled, "We Can't Get There From Here." I am a white woman. I am standing beside a black woman. We are facing a group of white people seated in front of us. We are in their workplace and have been hired by their employer to lead them in a dialogue about race. The room is filled with tension and charged with hostility. I have just presented a definition of racism that includes the acknowledgement that whites hold social institutional power over people of color. A white man is pounding his fist on the table. As he pounds, he yells, "A white person can't get a job anymore." I look around the room and see 40 employees, 38 of whom are white. Why is this white man so angry? Why is he being so careless about the impact of his anger? Why doesn't he notice the effect this outburst is having on the few people of color in the room? Why are all the white people either sitting in silent agreement with him or tuning out? I have, after all, only articulated a definition of racism. Now, I know that R DiAngelo hates the word colorblind. But when you're emotionally blind to somebody else and you don't recognize why they may have a reaction, that shows that you're not really understanding who you're talking to. I've led many discussions of people to talk about race. Never was the room hostile and problematic. And the reason why that's the case is when you have a discussion, it's about opening up the conversation that people should understand one another. People should be able to hear what other people have experienced, how they've had their lives affected by it. And when people are open to hearing about other people's experiences and they're able to share, they develop something called empathy and caring. But if I were to start off by stating to a room full of people who are writing about social justice, and I said, well, I know there's a definition of Nazis. Nazis were people that identified as the Aryan race, and they believed that there was a systematic change, that people were superior to other people based upon their color of their skin. The Aryan race was an ideology based upon skin. So anybody who talks about skin color would be a Nazi. Do you think that if I redefine Nazism that way, and I came up with the definition of Nazism that way, do you think that some people might be upset and get pushed back? Oh no, don't worry about it. You're just a Nazi in your way. But don't worry about being a Nazi. It's just your Nazism. And you're just being fragile in dealing with your Nazism. Do you think that maybe the tact of approaching the subject in this manner might be antagonistic and hurtful to people? That maybe it's psychologically not helpful to say to people, by the way, we know that the term racist is a really bad word, but don't worry, I'm just redefining you that way. And you should be okay with it. Something's wrong with you that you don't want to be called a racist. And it is that lack of understanding of human nature that I think makes her blind, not in terms of race, in terms of humanity. White people in North America live in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race. Now, again, factually speaking, you can go through many stats to show where there's a lot of inequalities between African Americans and the white population. Not a question. And white people are the beneficiaries and the separation and inequality. Now, again, this is important to recognize that this is a systemic issue of when you take a look at those numbers. But it's not on an individual level. You're going to find in this society African Americans doing much better than white people, and white people doing much poorer than African Americans. So this nature of, again, identifying everybody this way and then calling all people this way and saying, well, the reason why you're a beneficiary is because you're white, well, not so fast. It is true, there's an element of white privilege, and actually one of the videos before I actually explained this concept. White privilege is not something you choose, it's something that happens even when you have no clue. It's the way that somebody may see you, or the way that you may have nepotism in your life, where somebody gives you a shot that somebody else might have not gotten. There's a lot of elements of this framework that's got nothing to do. And I think that nobody here would ever say, well, no, that never happens, that doesn't exist. I think people would be able to hear that a lot better and a lot more readily than this idea that the system itself holds all white people over here, all black people over here, and it's doing this to everybody. Nobody's going to buy that because we see it with our own eyes. It's untrue. So when you're trying to help people to understand how certain people are held to a different standard, or they're not getting a fair shot at equity to be able to be, I hate the word equity, I'm sorry. I got to get rid of that word because it's been hijacked. Another word. What you want is equal opportunity. That we want ability for people to have the ability to have equal opportunity in life. And when you could say to somebody they're not getting equal opportunity, how can we help to raise them up? People are much more open to open their ears and go, you know something? Who's against that? It's not about pulling other people down. It's about lifting other people up or helping them to be lifted up. As a result, we are insulated from racial stress at the same time that we come to feel entitled to and deserving of our advantage. And again, nobody can be feeling entitled to an advantage when they don't recognize the advantage. So that is an oxymoron itself. In other words, you're saying on one level, this advantage is psychologically unconscious process. But on the same token, I don't want to change it because I feel it. I can't feel it if it's unconscious. It's like, no, it's not. It's when you're in denial of something. You don't know when you're in denial of something. You think you're absolutely fine when you're in denial. Given how seldom we experience racial discomfort in our society, we dominate, and we haven't had to build our racial stamina. I have no idea what racial stamina is, but I hope that one day she'll explain it to us. Socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that we are either unaware of or could never admit to ourselves. Now again, the unaware of would mean that you don't really believe that. It is the aspect of how it would manifest. And again, I don't believe that people walking around have a sense of superiority. I don't think that when most people go to basketball games or to concerts or to the politicians of a different color or race or religion, that they're sitting there going, oh my God, I'm just so superior to this guy. I don't think that when they say, can I get your autograph, please, and they start to idolize that person, that they think they're walking around superior to that person. I don't think people walking around going, Michael Jordan, God, he's just beneath me. I just don't think that's a mindset that people have. But again, there's no questioning of this in terms of ideology. It's all these things are a statement of this is the way that people think. And this is how people just walk around with no evidence, assertion after assertion about human behavior. Now, could you find people with these ideas? Absolutely. You could find people with these ideas. In fact, I think the person that wrote this book says these are her ideas. But I would call these ideas racist. We consider a challenge to our racial worldview as a challenge to our very identities as good moral people. Now, again, I would never consider a challenge to my racial worldview as a challenge to my identity. I think if somebody would be able to point out to me something that I'm doing, something that I say, something that I treat people, and said, you know, David, you're doing X, Y, or Z, and it's damaging to people. I think I'm very good at being able to say, oh, let me take a look at that, and let me see how I did that, and let's talk about that. And the reason why I can say it is it's happened, where people from different race or culture had a question about something I did. We sat down, we have a conversation about it, and about 99% of the time, it goes away, and they go, oh, wow, didn't realize, I'm so sorry, it was a misunderstanding. And misunderstandings happen between people all the time. But if you don't understand and you don't have a conversation about it, then the misunderstanding becomes, the reason why that misunderstanding happening is because of your status of thinking you're superior. No. Do you know how many times different minorities have insulted me at different points without realizing it? And I have to say, by the way, you might want to be aware of this, and they had no clue. Because people say things without recognizing that they can be saying things that are hurtful or damaging to somebody else. It's called being human. Thus, and by the way, we do want to be good and moral people. Very few people want to be, I'm a racist. Yeah, you want to be a racist? Sure, let's join be a racist. Anybody want to join the racist party? Because we don't believe racism is a good thing. And as a society, that's a wonderful thing. This was not true during the Civil War, when they ran on the idea of racism was the foundation of the Confederacy. If you read through the speeches of the time they were running, Stevens was his last name. He was running as the vice president for the Confederacy. In his speech, he talked about the cornerstone of the idea of the superior of the white man. And this was in his speech. So the idea that people don't have this ideology, well, they do. They're just white supremacists. Thus, we perceive any attempt to connect us to a system of racism as an unsettling or unfair moral offense. Now, if R DiAngelo said, well, this is how the system is racist, and this is what we need to do to fix it, and if we do this, it would help people, I think people would be open to hearing her point of view. I really do. And if she said, give an example of this, if she said the education system, because African Americans are in low poverty areas and because they're stuck in lower paying schools, and if you take a look at X, Y, or Z school, and if we did this type of system, it would help African Americans pull them out. People would be, oh, okay, let's take a look, let's think about that, and be open to an idea. But just stating the systems are all racist, every system created by a white person ever is racist, that's called a fallacy of overgeneralization. You're overgeneralizing your point, and you're stating nothing to actually make it, other than saying, well, things are unequal. Now, the fact that things are unequal, that's a statement of fact. But the question of why is not a nuanced position, it's something that's actually real. Okay. The smallest amount of racial stress is intolerable. The mere suggestion that being white has meaning often triggers a range of defensive responses. These include emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-induced situation. These responses work to reinstate white equilibrium as they repel the challenged return of our racial comfort and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. Wow. Again, I don't know where, I'm sure she'll get to it, where R DiAngelo grew up. But where I came from, it was a racially diverse area. And I was around people of different colors and different races and different religions from a very young age. My upbringing and her upbringing were not the same. And there was no racial hierarchy. There were people that I got along with on different sides. There were times they weren't, times I got along for other reasons, but never because of race. I conceptualize this process as white fragility. That's beautiful. She comes up with a process all by herself. That when you insult people and you call them names based upon the way that you like to redefine things, the same way that I redefine anybody who makes these definitions and changes them this way to create racial tension as Nazis, because that's what the Nazis did. And when Adolf Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, he utilized it to promote the German people to change. And that is what R DiAngelo wants. The same thing, change along racial lines. See? Nazi. Just like Adolf Hitler. So if I tell R DiAngelo and a group of people like her that anybody who's an anti-racist is really a Nazi, and I'm redefining Nazi to include this, but don't worry about it. Anybody that does that is a Nazi, so it's okay, and that's my new definition for you. I'm willing to bet that there would be a lot of pushback. These responses work to reinstate the white equilibrium and repel the challenged return of our racial discomfort and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. Again, she conceptualizes this process as white fragility. Through white fragility is triggered by discomfort and anxiety is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility is not a weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. I don't believe somebody getting upset in a boardroom about being called a racist is somebody that's protecting their whiteness. I think they're being insulted and they're being hurt and they're being acting out. Now, do I think that the way that they acted out was appropriate? No, I don't. But I understand why they would. The same way, if I walked into a room of people suffering from addiction and I said to everybody in this room, don't worry, all of you are morons. No, but I know moron means this. But for my definition, we're just going to call you morons because we're going to define it as anybody that does anything that's damaging to themselves because morons don't understand it. So therefore, if you are an addict, I promise you, the people in that room would want to rip my head off and I wouldn't blame them. Not one bit. Because when you take a word that has a definition and a negative one, and then you redefine somebody by it and go, don't worry about it, I'm just calling you that, it's not going to go well. Summarizing, the familiar pattern of white people's response to racial discomfort as white fragility has resonated for many people. The sensibility is so familiar because whereas our personal narratives vary, we are all swimming in the same racial water. For me, the recognition has come through my work. I have a rare job. On a daily basis, I lead primarily white audiences in discussions of race, something many of us avoid at all costs. Well, that's because she was around only white people. If you grew up around not white people, and you had a lot of interactions with people that weren't white, you're going to have a very different reaction, and having a conversation about these things become a lot easier. It is true that if you are a sheltered person and you only stay within your in-group, you're going to have a lot of myths and a lot of prejudice against groups that you don't know anything about. You're going to assume stereotypes are true because you basically don't have any knowledge to counteract it with. In the early days of my work, as what was then termed a diversity trainer, I was taken aback by how angry and defensive so many white people became at the suggestion that they were connected to racism in any way. Yeah, because nobody cares if they're connected to racism. We all love it. We all want to be racist. That's exactly correct, you Nazi. Because you don't care about being called a Nazi, because Nazi is a good thing based upon my redefinition of anybody that wants to change a definition to change things based upon racial lines. So, Nazi, do you like that? Would you accept that definition? And if you get upset by it, that's because of your fragility. In the early days of my work, getting back again, I couldn't understand their resentment and disinterest in learning more about such a complex social dynamic as racism. I love to learn about social dynamics such as racism. I love to see and be presented with different information and hear people's point of view. I have clients that have shared with me some incredible stories and things that they've been through. And I don't doubt it one bit. But this idea that she's going to walk around calling people racist, saying, I'm just going to say this, you're just going to accept this term, but don't get worried about it and don't have an emotional reaction to it, no problem, is a lack of understanding of anything about somebody's psyche. Right now, motivational interviewing is a technique very strongly pushed in terms of the field. And in the MI approach, the main idea of it is the understanding of the person's internal motivation to want to change. Coming about people from the idea of explaining to them, helping them develop empathy, helping them understand it, will motivate change. This is the exact opposite of that approach, which has actually been shown to be most effective. So what she's doing would be malpractice in terms of psychological session. By telling people and calling people names and labeling them the way that she does is absolutely inappropriate. These reactions were especially perplexing when there were a few or no people of color in the workplace, and they had the opportunities to learn from my co-facilitators of color. I assume that in these circumstances, an educational workshop on racism would be appreciated. After all, didn't the lack of diversity indicate a problem or at least suggest that some perspectives were missing? Now, this I absolutely agree with. I think there are places where certain people's perspectives are missing. But that's a point you bring up. Talk about that. Bring that up as an issue to talk about in a diversity training. Well, how would other people in different places look at the situation? But that's not what's done. Or that the participants might be undereducated about race because of scant cross-cultural interactions. And again, I actually may mention that before, that when you don't have a lot of interactions with other people from different cultures and race, you are going to be in your own bubble. But the same thing happens when you have an ideology. If you don't challenge or nobody challenges your ideology, you'll also fall into a bubble. And again, what I'm reading here is somebody that doesn't know historically and has led themselves into a bubble that has rewritten American history that's factually untrue. And there's a lot of people doing this right now. It took me several years to see beneath these reactions. At first, I was intimidated by them, and they held me back and kept me careful and quiet. But over time, I began to see what lay beneath this anger and resistance to discuss race or listen to people of color. And I would say it was your presentation. Because when you do this presentation correctly and you open it up, you don't get the hostility and this. This is just not what happens. You get people opening up to hearing other people's point of view, validating, helping people understand another point of view. It's actually a very amazingly wonderful process, and one I wish that you would have created. I observed consistent responses from a variety of participants. I wonder if you're seeing the same responses wherever you go. Maybe it's the facilitator that's facilitating those responses. It's very interesting. Where I work, one of the things that's interesting is that people meet me in the beginning and they have a negative view for about the first couple of times they see me, maybe once or twice. And then what happens is they get this really positive view. And by the time they graduate, they're talking about rave about this positive view. What changed? As one client put it to me many years ago, he said, David, I didn't know whether you were getting nicer or was I getting better. And what gave him the ability to do that, as many of the people that I worked with, is the idea of being respectful of their point of view and treating them with respect. And this is not a way to treat anybody with respect. You want to open up a diversity training and you want to discuss about the differences in how people are reacting emotionally. The last thing you want to do is say, you group over here, you are the problem, and you're subjugating everybody else over here, whether you recognize it or not. Yeah, that's going to go really well. I observed consistent responses from a variety of participants. For example, many white participants who lived in the white suburb neighborhoods and had not sustained relationships with people of color were absolutely certain that they held no racial prejudice or animosity. Now, again, obviously, that a person that says, I have never held racial prejudice and animosity is, again, somebody that's not self-aware. The nature is that we define things. And I'll give you an example of this, and maybe you'll understand it better this way. When you were a little kid, you saw a four-legged creature. And if the first four-legged creature you saw was a cat, and you learned the word cat, you would say cat. And then when a dog came by, and you saw this four-legged creature, you would say cat. And the reason is our human brains put things in groups, and we categorize them. It's actually the way that we learn. If you study Piaget, you understand that cognitively, this is how we categorize things and learn. And if you learn science, we do through nomenclature and we understand things, and then you have genus, species, if you remember your biology. But the nature of this helps people to learn. So if you help people to understand that they're going to have certain things about groups and certain beliefs about groups before that, and you explain to them, this is a natural process of the way you learn. You can't get away from that. But through seeing people and getting to know them, you start to see that there are differences in the group, and then your prejudices start to go away. It's a wonderful thing to watch. I'll give you an example of this from a TV show from the 1970s, All in the Family, where you see Archie Bunker, the racist, quote-unquote, of the show. As he gets to know Lionel, he actually develops an affinity for Lionel. Lionel is the African-American son of the Jeffersons. And he likes him as a person, and he has this really good relationship, and they actually get along really funny on the show. But the idea is that his idea about people he was unfamiliar with changes through the show, and he evolves as a character. Now, they did that for the TV show, but it's actually how it works in real life too, which is the reason why so many people related to that show and why it was so popular. Other participants simplistically reduced racism to a matter of nice people versus mean people. Most appear to believe that racism ended in 1865 with the end of slavery. Now, of course, anybody who believes that just doesn't understand, again, history. And sadly, because of the poor education system in this society, most people don't know history, or the Jim Crow laws, or what happened in the civil rights movement and why that was necessary. And actually, most people don't know that after 1865, African Americans were holding positions of power politically, and later that was taken away from them. But you can go through the history and learn about that yourself right now. There was both knee-jerk defensiveness about any suggestion that being white had meaningful and a refusal to acknowledge any advantage to being white. Many participants claimed white people were now the oppressed group, and they deeply resented anything perceived to be a form of affirmative action. These responses were so predictable, so consistent and reliable. I was able to stop taking the resistance personally and get past my own conflict avoidance and reflect on what was behind them. Somebody with this much insight, amazing into the human psyche, that she's going to be able to get past it and understand them when she doesn't understand their anger or what they're reacting to. By her own words, she's telling us what they're reacting to. All I'm doing is calling them Nazis. That's it. I don't understand. I'm just a Nazi. I'm just redefining the word Nazi for you and calling you a Nazi. Why are you getting upset for? But instead of helping people to see some of the nature of the way that things are in society and some advantages that people may have, and what do we think about them, and how do we think we can help other people to get past that or to be able to get that advantage, that is not the discussion. I began to see what I think as pillars of whiteness, the unexamined belief that prop up our racial responses. I could see the power of the belief that only bad people are racists. Yes, I think that according to the definition of racism, not according to her new definition, but according to the definition, racist would be a bad definition, as would be moron, as would be Nazi. Okay? So just to be aware, those would be bad definitions. I could see how we are taught to think about racism only as discrete acts committed by individuals rather than a complex, interconnected system. Yes, because a complex, interconnected system on its surface, if it doesn't have a rule that is designed to be racist, would not be. But the outcomes can lead to racist issues, and that's why you have to take a look at that. I'll give you an example of this from the court system. And this was in a movie called Juvenile Justice, where they asked a judge, why is it that African American kids are more likely to be sentenced to juvenile hall than white kids? And that was the question. And the judge said, well, the fact is the white kids have the financial means to be under watch at home with the ability for the parents to pay for keeping them in the house with the monitors on their legs and the ability for them to be monitored where they're going. And then the taxpayer would not have to pay for that. The parents would. So that was while the people of color that he was dealing with did not have that capacity to do that. Now, we could take a look at that and say, is that fair? And is that something we want to keep? That a judge should have the discretion to do that because it leads to a disproportionate number of white kids who are richer, because it's really richer not about color, but it disproportionately will affect people, specifically the neighborhood that this judge was talking about, and say, is that fair and is that something we want to keep? And then you could talk about it and help people to understand, oh, I could see how that could be a problem. But no, it's the system that's racist and everybody's a racist because of it. And in the light of so many white expressions of resentment towards people of color, I realize that we see ourselves as entitled to and deserving of more than people of color deserve. Right, because that's how white people think. They walk around saying to themselves, I deserve more than people of color. I saw our investment in a system that served us. I also saw how hard we worked to deny all of this and how defensive we became when these dynamics were named. In turn, I saw how our defensive maintained the racial status quo. Wow. Personal reflections of my own racism, a more critical view of media and other aspects of culture, and exposure to the perspectives of many brilliant and patient mentors of color all helped me to see how these pillars of racism worked. It became clear that if I believed that only bad people who intended to hurt others because of race could ever do so, I would respond with outrage of any suggestion that was involved in racism. Yes, you would. Of course that belief would make me feel falsely accused of something terrible. And of course I would want to defend my character. And I had certainly had many of my own moments of responding in just those ways to reflect on. I came to see that the way that we are taught to define racism makes it virtually impossible for white people to understand it. Given our racial insulations, coupled with misinformation, any suggestion that we're complacent in racism is a kind of unwelcome and insulting shock to the system. Yes, saying to white people that you are complacent in racism when so many people have fought against racism, do not like racism, try to stop racism, yes, is going to make people upset. So when you call them racist, by the very nature of their skin color, it's going to cause a problem. So I'm very glad that you recognize that. The problem is, you didn't come up with another word. You decided to use racism as the word. What a great idea! I wonder what can go wrong. If I have, however, I understand racism as a system into which I was socialized, I can receive feedback on my problematic racial patterns. Now the problem here is, there is again, just because there's disparity doesn't necessarily mean the system is racist. There are racial inequalities, that is true. Example, the NBA. The NBA is primarily African American. Would you say institutionally the NBA is racist against white people? Simple question, right? There's a racial disparity. Therefore, because it doesn't represent the population, the NBA is an inherently racist institution. Think about that for a moment. One of the greatest social fears for a white person is being told that something that we have said or done is racially problematic, yet somehow lets us know that we have just done such a thing rather than responding with gratitude or relief. After all, now that we're informed, we won't do it again. Except you haven't informed anybody what they wouldn't do again. You're just saying the institution itself is racist. That's not me not doing it again. If you were to say, when you say this to a person of color, you're hurting their feelings, you have the possibility of hurting their feelings, then yeah, that would be an issue. That's something you could point out. And by the way, in dealing with people of color, for as many years as I have and the amount of African American clients that I've worked with, I can't tell you one thing that you can't say to one person that somebody else might not take offense to, and that you can say to another that somebody else might not take offense to. Because everybody's different. African Americans are not monolithic. We often respond with anger and denial. Such moments can be experienced as something valuable, even if temporarily painful, only after we accept that racism is unavoidable and that it is impossible to completely escape, having developed problematic racial assumptions and behaviors. None of the white people whose action I describe in this book would identify as racist. In fact, they would most likely identify as racially progressive and vehemently deny any complicity with racism. Yet all their responses illustrate white fragility and how it holds racism in place. Their responses spur the daily frustrations and indignites, not a word I've ever used in a sentence, and indignites people of color endure from white people who see themselves as open-minded and thus not racist. This book is intended for us, for white progressives, who so often, despite our conscious intentions, make life so difficult for people of color. I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. I define white progressives as white people who think they are not racist, or less racist, or in the choir already gets it. White progressives can be the most difficult for people of color, because to agree that we think we have arrived, we will put our energy into making sure that others see us having arrived. None of our energy will go into what we need to be doing for the rest of our lives, engaging in an ongoing self-awareness, continuing education relationship, building an actually anti-racist practice. Wow. So now it is incumbent upon every single individual who believes that they're not racist to be a lifelong anti-racist. and be practicing it, as opposed to you live your life and don't do racist things to people and try not to discriminate and try to understand where people are coming from and try to be a person who is empathetic to other people's plights and on the ideas. No, we don't want to do that. We have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And anybody who's a liberal, oh, you're the worst of the worst. That's great, because insult the audience of your own book. So this is going to create people to become what's called masochistic. I am never good enough. I don't know if you've ever seen those shows where, generally you see this in the Christian religion, where they have those like spikes at the end of these like whips, and they sit there and they whip themselves till they bleed. And in actuality, that's what she's creating here, a new form of a religion. White progressives do indeed uphold and perpetuate racism, but our defensiveness and servitude make it virtually impossible to explain to us how we do so. Wow. Because no white progressive would ever listen to her. New York Times, bestseller book. I wonder who's buying it. Oh, it must be all the conservatives that are buying this book, because they're loving this and appreciating this. That must be the issue, right? Because her books are not being read by progressives, only conservatives. Racism has been among the most complex social dilemmas since the founding of this country. While there is no biological race as we understand it, so there is no race, race as a social construct has profound significance and shapes every aspect of our life. So now race is a social construct. And if race is a social construct, just like sex is a social construct, so then why can't I just change my race? And why can't the other person just change their race? Yet she earlier says about multicultural people that they're defined by the objective aspects of other people defining them. But wow, so another contradiction in its own mindset. Race will influence whether we will survive our birth. Wow, race will influence whether we survive our birth. I think she means to say there are racial disparities based upon income and access. That doesn't mean race does. It means money does. And just certain people have more money or less money. And that's, again, mischaracterizing an argument. And I love when people do that. Which schools we will attend, who our friends and partners will be, what careers we will have, how much money we will earn, how healthy we will be, and even how long we expect to live. This book does not attempt to provide the solution to racism. Wow, great, there's no solution here. Nor does it attempt to prove that racism exists. I start from that premise. Excellent. So it doesn't have to prove racism exists. You just could suppose it, and it has no solution. This is great. My goal is to make visible how one aspect of white sensibilities continue to hold racism in place, white fragility. That is a brilliant book. You don't have to prove anything. You assert anything that you like, and that becomes your rule of book. I will explain the phenomenon of white fragility and how it developed, how it protects racial inequality, and what we might do about it. And that is the end of the introduction. I hope that you see the insanity of the book. Now again, I will say this again. I don't think R DiAngelo is evil. I don't. I don't think she's a person who's sitting out there. I mean, I know she makes a fortune of money doing this, but I don't think her nature is to be evil. I don't. I think she's absolutely wrong. I think that her mindset is so off base, and I think her trainings are so damaging. I could understand in terms of analyzing her description of the events, her own description of the event, and the reactions of the people, and she's sitting there going, wow, I'm so surprised. I'm walking around calling people Nazis, and they're getting upset. I hope you found this helpful. I hope that you'll share this with other people. I hope people will stop buying this book. And I hope that, again, that you will like this video if you like it. I hope that you'll share it with other people so they can understand the concepts in this book that are so damaging. And if you disagree with anything I said, please put it in the comment below. I would love to be able to respond. And of course, if you'd like to become a patron and subscribe to this channel, hit the subscribe button, and the Patreon is down below in the Subscribe-star link. Have a good night, good mental health, and learn.